A lone figure stands atop a reed boat as waters rage around him. Lightning flashes across a blackened sky. The man looks up, terror and resolve mingling in his eyes. This is not Noah. This is Ziusudra, king of Sumer, living thousands of years before the Bible was ever written. The heavens open, water crashes down in sheets. The gods have spoken, and humanity's time has ended, except for one man. We all know the story of Noah's Ark, the righteous man who built a vessel to save himself, his family, and the animals from God's wrathful flood. It's a cornerstone of Western culture, retold to children and debated by scholars for millennia. But what if I told you that Noah was not the first? That his story is merely the latest retelling of an ancient tale that had already been circulating for thousands of years before the first words of Genesis were ever inscribed? The truth is explosive. Noah's Ark is not an original story. It is the Hebrew adaptation of a much older Mesopotamian flood myth that itself may have roots stretching all the way back into the dawn of civilization. Similar stories appear in cultures across the planet, from China to Greece, from India to indigenous America. Today, we dive into the ancient waters to discover the astonishing origins of humanity's most persistent disaster narrative. The year is 1872. British museum archaeologist George Smith sits hunched over a clay tablet, one of thousands recovered from the ruins of Nineveh in modern-day Iraq. As he carefully translates the ancient cuneiform script, his heart begins to race. The words describe a flood sent by angry gods, a man building a boat to save himself and the animals, even birds released to find dry land. Smith is reading the Epic of Gilgamesh, written nearly a millennium before the Hebrew Bible. In it, a man named Utnapishtim recounts how he survived a world-destroying flood, a story virtually identical to Noah's in its core elements. "I brought my family and relatives on board the ship," reads the ancient text. "The beasts of the field, the wild creatures, and all kinds of craftsmen I brought on board." Smith reportedly ran around the room in excitement, tearing off his clothes as the revelation hit him. He had discovered proof that the biblical flood story had Mesopotamian origins. But Gilgamesh wasn't even the original. Earlier still was the Akkadian story of Atrahasis from around 1700 BCE. And before that lies the oldest written flood story humanity has discovered, the Sumerian tale of Ziusudra. In the arid plains of southern Mesopotamia, the Sumerians created the world's first known civilization, and with it, humanity's first written literature. Among these precious texts is the story of King Ziusudra, dating back approximately 1600 BCE, though the oral traditions it captured are undoubtedly far older. The narrative tells how the great gods, An and Enlil, made a chilling decision to obliterate mankind with a catastrophic flood. But one deity, likely Enki, took pity on humanity. He whispered through a reed wall to warn Ziusudra, whose name aptly means life of long days. The god instructed this righteous king to build a massive boat to escape the coming deluge. For 7 days and 7 nights, storms ravaged the earth. Water engulfed cities, mountains, and all living things as Ziusudra's vessel was tossed upon the primordial seas. When the waters finally receded, the king emerged and made sacrifices in gratitude. For preserving the seed of mankind, the gods rewarded Ziusudra with eternal life and settled him in Dilmun, a paradise land reminiscent of Eden. What makes this account particularly astonishing is its integration into Sumerian historical records. The Sumerian king list, which meticulously recorded the reigns of monarchs, contains a striking interruption. "Then the flood swept over." This casual reference suggests the Sumerians viewed the Great Flood not as mere myth, but as historical event that reset the very foundation of their civilization. As Sumerian civilization gave way to Akkadian dominance in Mesopotamia, the flood story evolved into a more complex narrative, the Epic of Atrahasis, dating to the Old Babylonian period around the 17th century BCE. This tale provides the first clear motivation for the divine deluge. The gods, we learn, were exhausted by humanity's incessant noise and alarming overpopulation. The din of human activity had become so overwhelming that the divine council, led by Enlil, could find no rest. The solution was drastic: mark complete annihilation through a catastrophic flood. But once again, Enki, the clever water god who had crafted humans from clay, couldn't bear to see his creation destroyed. He secretly warned Atrahasis, whose name literally means exceedingly wise, instructing him to dismantle his house and build an extraordinary boat. Unlike Noah's rectangular ark, Atrahasis constructed a circular vessel resembling the round reed boats still used in parts of Iraq today. Atrahasis' epic contains a fascinating twist absent from later retellings. The gods, having nearly starved without human offerings during the flood, regretted their hasty decision. Rather than risk another self-defeating annihilation, they implemented more measured population controls, introducing infant mortality, barrenness, and other natural limits to keep humanity's numbers in check. This remarkably sophisticated explanation for human suffering and death provides a theological rationale missing from later versions. It presents the flood not just as divine punishment, but as critical turning point in the relationship between gods and humans, a cosmic reset leading to a more sustainable coexistence. The evidence is overwhelming. The biblical authors, without a doubt, adapted an already ancient story that was widely known throughout the ancient Near East. Even specific details betray this connection. Noah caulks his ark with pitch, using the Hebrew word kopher, which appears nowhere else in the Bible with this meaning. It's a direct borrowing from the Akkadian word kupru, used in the earlier Mesopotamian versions. Perhaps most telling is the divine response to sacrifice. After Noah's waters recede, he builds an altar and offers burnt offerings. Genesis tells us, "And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never curse the ground because of man." This mirrors the Mesopotamian versions almost exactly. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, when Utnapishtim offers sacrifice, the gods smelled the sweet savor and gathered like flies around the offering. This nearly identical language in divine psychology provides further evidence of direct literary borrowing. But the flood motif does not stop at the borders of Mesopotamia and Canaan. It flows across cultures spanning continents and millennia. In ancient Greece, Zeus floods the world to punish human wickedness, while Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha survive in a chest built on the advice of Prometheus. After landing on Mount Parnassus, they repopulate the earth by throwing stones over their shoulders, which transform into people. In Hindu mythology, Vishnu appears to the first man Manu as a tiny fish warning of an impending deluge. The fish grows enormous, and Manu ties his boat to its horn. The divine fish then guides the vessel through the turbulent waters to the safety of a mountain peak. Like Noah, Manu performs a sacrifice after the waters recede. Yet, in the shadow of these widespread flood narratives lies a fascinating exception. Ancient Egypt, a civilization defined by water, tells no tale of a destructive, world-ending deluge. Why this silence where we might expect the loudest echo? The answer lies in Egypt's unique relationship with flooding. Unlike the predictable, devastating floods of Mesopotamia, Egypt experienced the Nile's annual inundation as a blessing, a predictable, life-giving event that deposited fertile silt across farmlands. The Egyptians saw no terror in rising waters, they saw the very foundation of their prosperity. Egyptian creation myths tell not of destruction by water, but of creation from it. Their cosmology begins with Nun, the primordial waters from which the first mound of earth emerged. A beginning, not an end. When Egyptian gods grew angry with humanity, they chose different methods of punishment. In one haunting myth, Ra sends his daughter Sekhmet to punish human rebellion. Her rage creates not a flood of water, but a flood of blood, as she slaughters humans until tricked into drinking red-colored beer that calms her murderous frenzy. The Book of the Dead does speak of a future cosmic flood, returning the world to primordial waters, not as punishment for human sin, but as the natural completion of time's circle, not destruction, but transformation. This striking absence in a civilization so deeply connected to water reveals a profound truth. Our myths are shaped by our landscapes. Where floods bring chaos and death, stories warn of divine punishment. Where floods bring life and renewal, they become symbols of creation itself. Thousands of miles east of Egypt, across the mountains and deserts of Asia, another ancient civilization tells a flood story with startling echoes of Noah, yet with its own distinctive spiritual imprint. In the sacred Sanskrit text of Hindu tradition, we find the tale of Manu, the first man, the progenitor of humanity. The story begins with a tiny fish that Manu finds while washing his hands in a river. Taking pity on the creature, he places it in a jar for protection, but each day the fish grows larger, requiring ever bigger vessels, until finally Manu must release it into the ocean. It is then the fish reveals its true nature. Speaking with the voice of Vishnu, listen carefully. The divine fish warns, "For soon a great flood will sweep away all creatures. Build a strong boat, fill it with seeds of all plants, and wait for me." When the predicted deluge arrives, the fish, now gigantic, with a magnificent horn, returns to Manu. Following Vishnu's instructions, Manu ties his vessel to the horn, and through churning violent waters that devour the world, the divine fish guides the boat to safety atop the highest mountain. Alone in a drowned world, Manu performs a sacrifice of clarified butter, cream, and curds. From this ritual emerges a woman who introduces herself as Ida or Ila. Together, they become the progenitors of a new human race. What makes the Hindu story particularly significant is its antiquity. References to Manu as the performer of the first sacrifice appear in the Vedas, among the world's oldest religious texts, composed as early as 1500 BCE. This places the character of Manu at a date contemporaneous with the early development of the Mesopotamian versions. The Chinese tell of Gun and Yu, who worked for generations to control a devastating flood. Some versions mention the goddess Nuwa, saving humanity from cosmic waters. What explains this astonishing pattern repeating across cultures that had little or no contact with one another? The flood narrative extends far beyond the ancient centers of civilization. It permeates cultures across the globe with remarkable consistency. In Polynesia, where people have lived intimately with the ocean for millennia, we find Manu, who survives a world-destroying flood by taking refuge either on a mountain peak or in a great canoe. Hawaiian mythology tells of, and I may butcher this, Kiki Ka Hinali, a devastating flood caused by angry sea gods, with survivors clinging to the slopes of Mount Kia as waters consume the world below. Chinese mythology approaches the flood from a different angle, not as a single catastrophic event, but as a generational struggle. The heroes Gun and his son Yu work for years to control a devastating deluge, with Yu finally succeeding through a combination of engineering and divine assistance. In other versions, the goddess Nuwa repairs the sky with 5 colored stones to stop cosmic waters from drowning creation. Sounds like the rainbow, just like God in the Bible. The Norse people of Scandinavia put a macabre twist on the flood myth. In their cosmology, the world is drowned not in water, but in the blood of a giant, Ymir, whose murdered body becomes the substance of the world itself. Only Bergelmir and his wife survive this crimson flood inside a wooden chest or ark, later repopulating the earth with a new race of giants. Sounds like that Deucalion myth. For the Aztecs of Mesoamerica, the flood is not a singular event, but a recurring cosmic cycle. Their myths describe multiple world ages, or suns, each ending in catastrophe. Our current world was born after a great flood from which only a man named Coxcox and his wife survived, yet another echo of the familiar pattern. Among indigenous North American peoples, flood stories are astonishingly prevalent. The Cree Nation tells of a deluge from which only virtuous individuals escaped. Hopi mythology describes survival on a floating reed island when the Third World was destroyed by water. The Ojibwe recount how their trickster hero, Wenabuzu, built a raft to save animals as waters consumed the land, eventually recreating the world from a handful of mud. In Lakota tradition, a great flood caused by a vengeful water monster leaves only a single girl survivor, who repopulates the earth with the help of an eagle. What emerges from this global survey is nothing short of extraordinary, a pattern so consistent it demands explanation. Across these wildly diverse cultures, separated by vast oceans and impenetrable mountain ranges, the same motifs appear with uncanny regularity. Divine judgment, or cosmic catastrophe, as the catalyst. A warning given to chosen survivors. Construction of a vessel for escape. Preservation of life forms for the New World, landing on mountains or high ground, birds sent to find dry land, sacrifice offered in gratitude, repopulation of the earth, divine promise against future floods. The similarities are way too numerous, too specific to dismiss as coincidence. Yet these cultures had no known contact with each other. Many of these stories emerged before the age of widespread global exploration. How could such a specific narrative template become embedded in the mythological DNA of virtually every human culture? These aren't just stories, he says, his voice trembling with emotion. They're the shared memory of humanity. Three powerful possibilities emerge to explain the global flood myth phenomenon. First, could these stories preserve the cultural memory of actual catastrophic floods? The end of the last ice age around 10,000 BCE caused dramatic sea level rises worldwide. The Black Sea flooded dramatically around 5600 BCE when Mediterranean waters breached the Bosporus. The fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates suffered devastating floods throughout recorded history. Second, perhaps flood myths represent a psychological archetype, a universal human fear of chaos and destruction, balanced by hope for survival and renewal. Water simultaneously represents death and rebirth, destruction and purification, endings and beginnings. These dualities resonate across human experience regardless of culture. Third, the similarities might result from cultural diffusion, stories spreading through trade networks, migrations, and conquests. As the narratives traveled, they were adapted to local conditions and belief systems while maintaining their core elements. In all reality, the truth likely combines all three explanations. Actual flood events created the foundation, psychological resonance gave them staying power, and cultural exchanges spread them far and wide. What's undeniable is that the biblical account of Noah represents just one iteration of humanity's oldest continuous narrative. The story was ancient before Moses was born, if he ever existed. It had traveled around the world before Abraham left Ur. He probably never existed either. So when we read the Genesis flood account, we're experiencing just one version of a story that has shaped human consciousness across millennia and continents. The Noah narrative isn't diminished by this context, it's enriched. In my view, it becomes part of a vast human conversation about destruction and survival, divine judgment and mercy, endings and beginnings. Why has the flood myth persisted with such tenacity across cultures and time? Perhaps because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience, our vulnerability in the face of natural forces, our fear of divine judgment, our hope for redemption, and our drive to survive against overwhelming odds. As climate change threatens to bring rising seas and extreme weather events, the ancient flood narratives take on a new relevance. Once again, humanity faces the prospect of waters that may reshape our world. Once again, we must decide what to preserve, what to let go, and how to build our metaphorical arcs. The flood myths remind us that catastrophe has always been part of the human story, and so has survival. They assure us that even after the waters rise, there will be mountains where we can rebuild. They warn us of our capacity for destructive behavior while affirming our potential for renewal. In the end, these stories aren't just about water. They're about us, our resilience, our moral struggles, our relationship with the divine, and our eternal hope that something of value will survive when the waters finally recede. What will we take aboard our ark as the waters rise in our own time? What world will we build when we reach our dry land? The oldest story is also our newest challenge.